I'm Avital's father, David Rubin. Today I'm not speaking as the former mayor of Shiloh, nor am I speaking mainly as a political commentator, and I'm not speaking as an author. Today I'm focusing on the psychological trauma that Avital and thousands of children in the biblical heartland of Israel have suffered from because it's usually ignored. On that fateful night that Avital just told you about, which was the last night of Hanukkah, we were driving home from Jerusalem when the car was hit with a hail of Kalashnikov or AK-47 bullets. Our car went completely dead and I felt a bullet crash into my left leg. Blood was gushing out of my leg as I turned to Rubin, my 3-year-old son, who was sitting behind me in the baby seat. He looked like he was trying to scream or to cry, but no sounds were coming out, so I figured he was just in shock. After several failed attempts to start the car, the engine burst into action as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas and I drove 170 kilometers an hour, that's about 110 miles an hour, to get to the next community up the road where an ambulance soon arrived and the paramedics discovered that my son had been shot in the head, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. But we later learned the bullet had missed his brainstem, thankfully by 1 millimeter. While flat on my back in the emergency room, I was told that I was the 1,000th terror victim to be hospitalized in that hospital in that previous year and a half. When a terror attack is reported in the news, it seems to be an absurd numbers game. We hear 3 dead and 7 wounded, 5 killed and 13 wounded. And then the media goes on to discuss the physical wounds, but the psychological trauma to individuals and communities is usually not discussed. There's a street in my neighborhood in Shiloh, which I call Terror Victims Row. Let's take an imaginary walk through this neighborhood, through this very real street. The first house is the Eldar family, whose 16-year-old son, Yonatan, was murdered by terrorists. In the second house is the Yerushalmi family. Their son Shmuel, 17 years old, was killed by a terrorist while he was standing at a bus stop. In the very next house on that street lives the Kessler family, whose 19-year-old granddaughter Gila was also murdered while standing at a bus stop. 3 houses further down that street lived the Seatone family, whose 17-year-old son Avi was killed in a terrorist massacre at his high school. You go around the corner from that house and you come to the Shoham family, whose 5-month-old baby was killed when terrorists on the side of the road hit him in the head with a massive rock while the young family was traveling home from a visit to the grandparents. There have been so many other terror victims in our area, but I've only described these so you will understand the intensity and the savagery of this terror war and the human suffering. But there is hope, which I will soon explain. After my 3-year-old son and I were wounded, we both had 2 operations. But when he finally came home from the hospital, he was screaming in the middle of the night several times a week, almost like that scream that he seemed to be trying to make in the car, but he couldn't make. It was clear that there was deep psychological trauma, but how do you treat a 3-year-old who is suffering emotionally? We were at a loss. 2 weeks later, I was sitting in my living room and my son, still with a bandage on the back of his head, was playing in a toy car. He picked up a doll and he looked over in my direction and he shouted out, "This is the Abba, this is the father. He has a hole in his leg," which indeed I did, even after plastic surgery. Then picking up another doll, he cried out, "This is the little baby. He was shot in the head." And my eyes filled with tears as I became very emotional because I realized that this was the first time he had expressed anything about the attack since it happened. I also realized that this is how we can heal his deep emotional trauma, through play therapy, because children are not like adults. An adult can usually sit and talk it out with a therapist. Children, despite their seeming openness, When confronted with trauma, they bury it inside. And if not treated, it comes out in all the wrong ways, in sleepless nights, in sudden bursts of anger, and panic attacks, as you just heard from Avital. When our recovery was near completion, I started the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund for the purpose of healing the trauma of the terror victim children and restoring some of the lost innocence of childhood that had been stolen from so many lives. As you saw with my daughter, sometimes trauma can be worse in those who haven't been physically wounded themselves. It's not an exaggeration to say that there is hardly a child in Shiloh and many other communities in Samaria that does not have a family member or a friend or a neighbor or a teacher who was killed or wounded in a terrorist attack. Every child has been affected, and every child needs our support. 13 years later, we now have a magnificent therapeutic educational campus with a formal therapy center using art therapy, music therapy, movement therapy, bibliotherapy. We have a separate horse farm for therapeutic horseback riding. And on that campus, 2 regional schools, kindergartens, informal therapy stations, such as a music playground and studio, and a petting zoo for animal-assisted therapy. And it works. Over 2,000 children are served on that one campus, with many others served in surrounding communities and in other parts of Samaria. We are also building playgrounds with communities, within communities, and we support youth programs and summer camps. In our summer camps, the children learn to swim, to play sports, and to go hiking. In a different part of Samaria, I must point out, controlled by Mahmoud Abbas's Palestinian Authority, there is another summer camp that is named after an arch-terrorist and is run by Abbas's Fatah terrorist organization. And there's another summer camp in Gaza that is run by Hamas, at which the children learn the great value of jihad, holy war against all non-Muslims. In both of these camps, the children also learn to use AK-47 assault rifles, just like the ones that wounded my son and me. It's also instructive to point out that the terrorists who wounded us were from the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, a branch of Abbas's Fatah. They are now in jail, but as terrorists who wounded Jews, they receive regular payments from the Palestinian Authority. Sadly, there is a sickness in the Islamic world that needs to be healed. It's a strange analogy, perhaps, but just as we in the biblical heartland of Israel are healing children and rebuilding for the future, an Islam that truly wants peace must heal itself of this sick jihadist mentality that teaches children to hate and to kill and to seek dominance over Jews and Christians. You are going to hear a panel discussions on global terrorism, and many other speakers will voice their opinions. But please don't neglect the human side. Don't neglect the human side of this issue, because we can and we must make things better for the children. Our greatest role in this world is to turn darkness into light and bitterness into sweetness. If you really want to understand terrorism, get in touch with me, and I can schedule a very informative morning visit to our therapeutic educational campus in Shiloh, where we are rebuilding lives and restoring hopes for the future. While you're there, you can also visit ancient Shiloh, which was the capital city of Israel for 369 years. Last but not least, I brought 2 of my books with me here today: The Islamic Tsunami and Peace for Peace, which address the existential threat to Israel, to America, and to the free world, as well as a historically correct and pragmatic approach to the peace process. Everyone who is here today is welcome to receive a complimentary copy from my books table, which is outside at the Jerusalem Post table. Yasser Arafat, after his infamous "with blood and fire and jihad we will liberate Jerusalem" speech, which he gave in a mosque in South Africa, he defensively stated, "I will continue my jihad for peace." Well, I will let all of you interpret that oxymoron as you wish, but I prefer to say and do the opposite. My response to the terrorists is, we will continue to rebuild lives and rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel through the children. Thank you very much.